Halo and Arcane are two properties that have no right being compared to one another. Both are shows based on popular video game franchises that have been a staple in the community for decades. One is a sci-fi epic FPS, and the other is a fantasy steampunk MOBA. Magic and monsters in one, technology and aliens in the other. They are as far apart as you can imagine. And what separates them even further is the fact that one had an extremely engaging series that was beloved by old and new fans alike, and the other had a bland, subpar, generic series that was greatly criticized by fans old and new alike. Can you guess which is which? Looking back at how Halo and Arcane performed is a perfect lesson in how to translate a video game property into the small screen. So today we'll be looking at the narrative elements of each and figuring out why one works while the other doesn't. Also, I'm going to be avoiding any visual or quality comparisons. This is simply a narrative breakdown. So we'll be ignoring any bouncy and poor CGI or unpainted plasma pistols or beautiful on-screen effects to show the fracturing of one's mind. Full spoilers ahead for Season 1 of Arcane and Halo. What I find fascinating about each series is the aspect of duality. This is a mirroring concept between the two shows. Arcane, for example, deals with two halves of everything. Two cities, rich and poor, Vi and Jinx, Silco and Vander, diplomacy or war. You get the idea. There are two halves to everything. And Halo's no different. Man versus machine, government versus insurrectionist, Makee and John, obedience versus subservience. Again, there are two halves to everything. However, the difference between these two narratives is how Arcane handles this concept of duality versus how Halo handles this concept of duality. Let's begin with this man versus machine aspect of Halo. This is a concept that has been brought up in more recent Halo games. Gone are the days of the stoic green man shooting aliens and dropping one-liners. And as a longtime Halo fan, I genuinely like that idea. I feel like that's an interesting direction to take the character of Master Chief after seeing him defeat the Covenant and stop the war. He was a man built for one purpose. So what purpose does he have if there's no war to be fought? Well, it's not answered very well in the games, but it's a good question nonetheless. In the Halo show, it isn't but 45 minutes or so in the first episode before Chief goes AWOL and abandons the UNSC. What follows is him going on a very emotional journey of finding memories and regaining emotions and whatnot. However, the thing is, it doesn't feel earned. We are told that Chief was the best of the best and that he would kill anyone without a second thought. He was the perfect killing machine, the perfect soldier. But from our point of view, he's just been an emotional wreck. All of Chief's emotional outbursts don't feel earned because that's all we've seen him as. We never saw the robot. We barely even saw the soldier. Yet for 9 episodes, we see him like this. Jumping back to Arcane, imagine if episode 3 was actually how episode 1 started. All of the character development of Powder from the first 2.5 hours would be non-existent, and all we're left with is this crazy Harley Quinn knockoff. It wouldn't feel earned because the relationships weren't established. So, because Arcane took the time to set up the relationships between Vi, Powder, Vander, Milo, and Clagger, we understand and empathize more with her sudden change. And we as the audience feel hurt when Vi feels hurt because we felt the loss of the sweet and innocent little girl, Powder. Because we saw that change, we empathize with the character because the empathy was earned, not expected. But this isn't the last time something in Halo wasn't earned. In keeping with the theme of duality, let's talk about the character of Quan, the insurrectionist versus the soldier. As Chief is rebelling against the UNSC, who better to rebel with than a rebel? But this relationship is only explored in 2 episodes, if that. Here you have a character who is questioning everything he thought he knew about his place in the universe, and here you have another character who's been fighting against everything Chief thought he stood by. But that relationship isn't explored, and yet the show expects us to care about Quan. After Chief leaves, why should we care? At that point in the show, Chief saved her twice, really, then left her with Soren. Soren, mind you, is a character we see in a flashback that Chief almost went AWOL with when they were in training. The Loyalist and the Rebel. Yet it is barely touched on. Instead, the show pairs up the two rebels, two individuals with a lot of the same thoughts and values, giving them no room to grow from one another. Soren and Quan juxtaposed against Vi and Caitlin is a very interesting comparison as well. Vi is an undercity convict, and Caitlin is the daughter of a very wealthy counselor. They learn from one another and grow to understand each other. At multiple points, Vi berates Caitlin for having a soft life and not knowing the hardships she went through, all the while undermining Caitlin's actual skill and knowledge, something we see earlier that Caitlin is actively dealing with from her own enforcer comrades. That dynamic would have worked perfectly for Chief and Quan. With Chief there, it would have been really interesting to see their dueling ideals conflicting with one another. That leads to character growth like Vi and Caitlin. Quan can teach Chief to be human, all the while Chief can teach Quan that violence and anger isn't the answer. Yet those two went off on their own separate character arcs. Well, character arcs may be giving the show a little too much credit. Each went off on their own journey and somewhat came to that conclusion on their own, maybe? Those two should have stayed together like Vi and Caitlin because they are, as Vi states,
oil and water. Was it meant to be? You're just saying that.
And that point of oil and water is where I want to go next. Duality aspects aside, it feels as if Halo is oil and water. Halo is trying so hard to not be the game, all the while trying its hardest to be the game. Halo has to remind you it's from a video game with its winks and nods to the game with incorrect sound effects, direct quotes, and first-person action scenes. However, story-wise, it's as far from the games as you can imagine. By the time of Halo Combat Evolved, the Human Covenant War has been raging for 27 years, and humanity is losing. In the show, we have no idea how long the war has been going on. In fact, the Covenant barely feels like a threat, maybe equivalent to some Outer Rim space pirates or something. We are not given a sense of urgency or desperation on humanity's behalf. All we get is some video footage of them post-glassing a planet and 3 fight scenes. Yet from what the Halo show has told us, humanity is the real threat. John was kidnapped, brainwashed, and augmented to kill. Everything Chief has seen about humanity has been awful. Everything the show has told/shown us about humanity has been awful. Yet we're supposed to just go with the aliens being the bad guys? What, because they're the bad guys in the games? The games the show is actively trying to avoid? What's also really funny is that while watching the show, I honestly thought that Chief should join the Covenant. Because why not? The show has shown us that humanity has been Chief's enemy. They lied to him about every aspect of his life. Then McKee comes around telling him the Covenant wants to take everyone on the great journey to live in paradise or something. Why would Chief not believe her? His allies have all lied to him his entire life and only want him to be a mindless killing machine. The Covenant has done nothing to him, yet he fights them only because the UNSC told him to. Unless Chief was there during first contact, all he has to go off of is what the UNSC has told him, and they've lied to him countless times. So maybe the UNSC were the aggressors and the Covenant is merely fighting back. And maybe the glassing footage was faked because it's not like the first time they faked something. And from what we've seen, the Covenant is nothing more than an annoyance to humanity because the people of Madrigal barely know they exist. So why not join the Covenant? They take humans, apparently. So the Halo show wants to be its own thing, separate from the games. We've known this before the show's released. In fact, a direct quote from Season 1 showrunner Stephen Kane from Variety states that, quote, "We didn't look at the game. We didn't talk about the game. We talked about the characters and the world. So I never felt limited by it being a game," end quote. They simply focused on the books for the show. However, the books are supplemental to the games. The books make you appreciate the games more. They enhance the story of the games. So the show is set in its own universe, following its own timeline, separate from the games, which is fine and dandy, but the show doesn't feel like Halo. It feels like some generic sci-fi show. As an experiment, I'm going to put up 3 images from sci-fi shows. Only one is from Halo. Can you tell which one it is? There's my point. They are desperately trying their hardest to be something other than Halo, yet they want to slap Halo in the title. To quote Filmento, "You can't just leech off the value of a franchise without utilizing what makes the franchise valuable." If anything, the Halo show feels like a generic sci-fi show that couldn't be sold to anyone, so they slapped a coat of Halo paint onto it, and then boom, it's a Halo show. Now, in contrast, I can't speak much on Arcane lore because I'm not a big League of Legends fan, but from what I've gathered is that the show is a fairly faithful adaptation of the lore. Sure, there are a few changes here and there, but they're not jarring and they don't take away from the world. They're not as drastic as making a character who never takes off his helmet decide to never even wear it, or throw a Chevy Tahoe in the background on a planet in the 26th century. My point is, Arcane leans into the lore. It doesn't lean away, which is its main strength. It embraces its weirdness. It takes the lore from the games and tells a beautiful story. And not only that, it's a video game property that doesn't need to remind you it's a video game property. It'd be super jarring if during a fight the camera just switches to a top-down perspective and shows some nerd in the corner breaking his keyboard. Arcane embraces the story. They embrace everything about League of Legends. In fact, I believe the main differences between Halo and Arcane is that one was made with genuine passion and love for the source material, while the other was simply seeking to change it. All in all, the Halo show wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. It just wasn't made for me. But Arcane also wasn't made for me. Arcane was made for League of Legends fans. They took the story of League and grew the lore, carefully cultivating a brilliant story about sisterhood, poor versus rich, and the inequalities of life, and really made a love letter to the fans. The reason Arcane works so well is because they knew their audience and catered directly to them. And it was really good because of it. So good that due to its success among League fans, it spread to non-League fans and made them League fans. What's really interesting about Arcane not being made for me is the fact that I don't know who's a League character and who's not. And because of that, people like me will probably enjoy the show even more than pre-existing fans. I'm sure Vi, Jace, Victor, and Jinx are all League characters, and I'm sure there are references from the game scattered throughout the show. But character-wise, we have no idea who's going to live or die. Not knowing who is from the games makes every near-death interaction all the more tense for non-fans. This is the benefit of the show not being made for me or people like me. We actually have a benefit and enjoy it all the more than pre-existing fans. Yet pre-existing fans enjoy it because they know who's who and what's what, and get more insight on the world they already know and love. They unintentionally cater to both types of viewers, the old fans and the new fans. Halo, on the other hand, didn't do that. General manager of 343 Studios, Bonnie Ross, told the Washington Post, quote, "I think it's a huge opportunity for us being able to go off consoles and think about a broader audience." Halo is aiming for a broader audience. They aren't making the games for Halo fans anymore, and the show also wasn't made for Halo fans. It is specifically catering to people who don't know anything about Halo, and in doing so, they shoot themselves in the foot. Because what makes Halo Halo isn't present in the show, and what we're left with is some generic sci-fi show. Knowing this beforehand, I went into the show pretending to not be a fan. I pushed out all prior Halo knowledge. I ignored the fact that I've been playing Halo since I was a kid, that I have every single Halo game, read a lot of the books, and that I have watched hundreds of hours of Halo videos from Hidden Xperia, Halo Canon, and late night gaming. I ignored the fact that I have too many Halo toys and write Halo fanfiction, and that I have a cameo from Jeff Steitzer telling me to shut up.
Shane, please, shut up!
And that Halo is one of my favorite franchises of all time. I ignored all of that and just watched Halo as a new fan. And it still disappointed. In their quest to make Halo for a broader audience, they inherently lost sight of what made Halo the amazing franchise that it was. Instead, they told a generic sci-fi show with occasional Halo references. Watching the show as a Halo fan actually ruined it for me. And watching it as a new fan made me think Halo is nothing more than some stereotypical sci-fi show no different than Firefly or The Expanse. I didn't get the benefit of knowing who's who and what's what because it's nothing like the books or the games. I also didn't get the benefit of being a new fan because the story was so boring and strange that I just didn't care enough to become invested. Essentially, while attempting to ignore pre-existing fans and pander to a broader audience, the show unintentionally caters to neither. And what's left is a hollow, uninspired sci-fi show that many, if not all, will simply forget about as time moves on.